She had buried her husband alone, walked 3 days through July mud, and when her knees finally gave out in the middle of a road that had no end, she didn't pray. She didn't cry. She picked up a rock. That single moment tells you everything you need to know about Clara Whitmore, and it's only the beginning. This channel is where the West lives, in the dust and the heartbreak, in the love that refuses to quit, in the strangers who become family on the hardest roads. Every story here carries one truth. The people who change the world are usually the ones nobody came to help. If that moves something in you, like, share and subscribe, because this story is just getting started. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
That July heat showed no mercy, turning the red earth into a thick, greedy mud. Clara had been on foot for 3 days. The horse she borrowed threw a shoe 6 miles back and went lame in an instant. There was no time to feel sorry for herself. She tied the poor creature to a tree and just kept moving forward. She no longer had the luxury of stopping for anything. Her boots were soaked clean through. The bottom of her only dress was stained the color of dried blood from being dragged through the mud. It felt like the land itself was trying to swallow her whole. In her bag, she carried $3.40, a photo of her James, her mother's little Bible, and a sealed leather satchel. That satchel was the reason James was dead, and she would protect it with her life. She refused to cry. She knew if she started, the tears would never stop. So she just kept on walking. She pushed through the second day as blisters on her feet broke and bled into her socks. That night, a cold rain began to fall, which made no sense in the middle of July. On the morning of her third day, with 12 long miles still ahead of her, her body gave out. She didn't fall gracefully. She crashed into the mud, one knee at a time, and stayed there with her head bowed. "I cannot go any further," she whispered. She thought she was alone. "You figure on staying down there long?" a voice asked from behind her. It was a man's voice, low and steady. She was too exhausted to scream. Instead, her hand closed around a small rock in the mud, and she slowly turned on her knees to face him. He was on a dark horse about 20 feet away, sitting tall in the saddle. His wide-brimmed hat was dark with rain, and his gray eyes seemed to have seen too much of the world. He was not pointing a gun at her. His hands were loose on the reins. He did not seem to be a threat. Still, she kept the rock raised. "I'll ask you one more time," he said, with an odd sort of patience. "You plan on staying down there?" "I plan on getting up," Clara answered, "on my own time." "Your time might be running out, ma'am." "Do not call me ma'am." He tilted his head slightly. "Then what should I call you?" "Nothing. You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "I sure don't." He just sat there watching her quietly. Her arm started to tremble from pure exhaustion. She lowered the rock, not out of trust, but because she could not hold it anymore. "There are men coming for me," she warned him. "If you are smart, you will ride on." "How far back?" he asked. "Half a day, maybe less." "How many of them?" "3. Something shifted in his eyes. He seemed to be doing some quick thinking. "Are they working for Decker Voss?" he asked. Clara froze completely. The world seemed to stop as the rain fell around her. "How do you know that name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because 4 days ago," he said, "Decker Voss paid me $50 to find a woman named Clara Whitmore and bring her back to Redstone Creek." The silence that followed felt louder than any noise she had ever heard. Her mind raced, searching for any way out. "I am not going to do it," the man said. "Bring you back, that is. I am not taking you back." "Why not?" she asked, her voice hard with suspicion. He swung down from the horse with slow, deliberate movements. He took his hat off. In the gray light, she saw a long white scar that ran from his eye to his jaw. His eyes were not cold, she realized, just bone-tired. "My name is Elias Calhoun," he said. "I have been a bounty hunter for 9 years. In all that time, I have never once harmed a woman. And I do not intend to start now." "Those are fine words," Clara said. "But that does not answer my question." He put his hat back on his head. "Get up," he said, his tone direct. "We need to move before those men get any closer." "You did not answer me." "I know," he said, offering her his hand. "I will answer you when you are not sitting in the middle of a muddy road. Deal?" Clara looked at the empty road ahead, then back at his hand. Finally, she took it. His name was Elias Calhoun, and he was a quiet man. She learned that quickly as they rode on his horse, whose name was Cannon. She decided she would hold him to his promise and wait for her answer. They rode for nearly an hour before he spoke again. "Those men behind us," he said. "Do you know their names?" "Harlan Briggs and another they call Copper," she replied. "The third man, I only heard them call Dutch." A hardness entered Elias's voice. "Briggs is the man Voss uses when he wants something burned." Clara's throat went tight. "My husband's barn," she said softly. 6 months ago. James told me it was a lightning strike." "Was it?" Elias asked gently. She repeated the words. "James said it was lightning," and her tone made it clear that neither of them had truly believed it. "Where are we going?" she asked after a moment. "To a town called Dusty Creek," he said. "It is 8 miles from here. Head northeast. There is a woman out there, Nell Briggs, who runs the only decent place between here and San Antonio. She owes me one. And what matters more, she despises Voss." "Everybody despises Voss," Clara said. "That does not mean they would stand against him. Nell will. How can you be so sure? Because he tried to buy her in 3 years back. She threw his money at him through the window, 1 coin at a time." A small smile touched his lips. Clara almost laughed, but the feeling vanished. The heavy weight settled back in her chest. She clutched the canvas bag. "The satchel in my bag, you know what it holds?" "Voss never shares details." She took a deep breath. "My husband was James Whitmore. He kept the books for Decker Voss for 4 years. James was an honest man. That was his downfall. He could not make crooked numbers look straight, which is what Voss needed. Voss has been buying up land, or what he calls buying. The truth is, he threatens families, runs off ranchers, and bribes officials to forge documents. And if someone refuses to leave Briggs," Eli finished for her. "James kept a record," Clara said. "He did not mean to. It was not some brave plan. He was just a man who wrote things down. It was his nature. Then one day, about 8 months ago, he saw the name of a family he knew on a file. The Henrys. Garland and May Henry. They had 3 children. Voss ran them out of Caldwell County last spring. Their youngest boy broke his leg during the move." "I know that name," Eli said softly. James did not eat or sleep that night. By morning, he had copied everything into a second ledger. He hid it in the root cellar. She could see it all so clearly. James at the table, the lamp burning low, his careful handwriting filling page after page, his jaw set with a decision that he knew would come at a high price. He told me about it 6 weeks later. He said he was taking it to a federal judge in San Antonio named Hargrove. James believed Hargrove was the only judge that Voss had not bought. "Hargrove is a fair man," Eli confirmed. "I have brought men before him. He is fair." Clara let out a shaky breath. James planned to ride to San Antonio in April. He was going to go alone, real quiet, so nobody would know. "But someone always knows," Eli said. He did not have to explain. She understood how it worked with small towns and big money. Men who work for powerful people learn to keep their eyes open. They came on a Tuesday morning, she said. James was on the porch with his coffee. She stopped speaking. She had told this story twice before. Once to herself in the dark, just to feel the reality of it, and once to the old woman who lent her the horse. But telling it to a stranger on a muddy road felt different. You do not have to, Eli said. I know, she replied. I want to. I need to say it to someone who has not already made up their mind. He remained quiet, letting her speak. They shot him twice, she said. I was inside and heard it. By the time I reached the door, he was on the porch floor. Two men on horseback were in the yard. One of them looked right at me. He did not move toward me. He just looked, and then they rode off. They wanted you to know it was a warning, Eli said. Yes. Did you run then? Not at first. I stayed to do what was needed for James, then I took the ledger, and I ran. Eli glanced back at her. His eyes held no pity. They held something harder, something that looked like he understood. How long has it been, he asked. 23 days. He faced the road again. That is a long time to be running, he said. Yes, she agreed, it is. Dusty Creek was the kind of town that did not ask questions, mainly because curiosity often led to trouble no one wanted. It was a place you just passed through. The town was just a handful of dusty buildings on a single dirt road. Nell Briggs' place was called the Copper Kettle. It was a boarding house, a restaurant, and a saloon all in one, though it did not advertise any of it. It was the biggest building on the street. When Eli opened the door with Clara behind him, the woman at the counter looked up. Elias Calhoun, you look like you have been chewed up and spit out by the road. I have, he said. I need a room, a meal, and for you to be quiet about it. Nell Briggs was a woman somewhere between 40 and 60. She had silver hair pinned up and sharp eyes that saw everything. She carried herself like a woman who learned long ago how to handle the world. She put down the glass she was wiping and looked at Clara. Who is she? She needs the same things I do, Eli said, and a lock on her door tonight. Nell stared at Clara for a moment. Clara was too tired to hide her exhaustion. Whitmore, Nell stated. It was not a question. Clara lifted her chin. Yes. I heard about your husband, Nell said in a steady voice. I am sorry for what happened. Thank you. Voss's men came through here 3 days ago asking for you. What did you tell them? I told them I had not seen any young widow, and I said any woman with sense would travel the south road, not the north. Nell placed a key on the bar. They went south. Clara finally breathed out. They will figure it out, Eli warned. By morning, maybe sooner. We have to leave before dawn. Food will be ready in an hour, Nell said. Rooms are upstairs, second door. There is a bolt. I take it you will need separate rooms. Yes, Clara said. Yes, Eli said at the same time. Nell looked between them, completely unsurprised. Separate rooms, she confirmed. Dinner in an hour. In her room, Clara washed her face and hands. She changed into her better blue dress. She had saved it for San Antonio, for Judge Hargrove's office. She believed a clean dress might make her story more believable. She knew how sad that thought was. She sat on the bed and opened the leather satchel. She had read its contents 100 times, but she looked again. It was the only thing that gave her a feeling of control. James's neat handwriting filled every page. Names, dates, payments, altered deeds, and displaced families. It was a careful record written by a man who knew that one day someone would need to read it and believe it. He had written it all down as clear testimony. Clara had counted them. 47 families across 3 counties, all run off their land over 6 years. Every single one was documented by James Whitmore's steady hand. She put the papers back and tied the cord. She was still sitting there when Eli knocked. Miss Whitmore, dinner is ready. I will be down in a moment. There was a pause. Are you all right? She thought about the question. I am upright, she answered. That is the best I have got right now. Another pause. That is enough, he said. She heard his footsteps move down the hall. She slung the bag over her shoulder, checked the window lock, and went downstairs. They ate at a small table in a back corner. The food was beans, salt pork, and cornbread. It was the best meal Clara had eaten in 3 weeks. She was past the point of caring what the food tasted like and ate fast. Eli ate the same way, all business, like a man who knew what it meant to go hungry. When she could finally breathe between bites, she looked up. You said you'd answer my question. He set his fork down and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I did, he said. Why didn't you take me back to Voss? He stared into his cup for a long second. Because I have a son. Clara waited for more. Had a son, he corrected, and the words cost him dearly. His name was Henry. He was 4 years old. The feeling in the room shifted. Abilene, she said softly, last year. His eyes snapped to hers. You know about it. Nell told me. She said it was a fire. It was a fire, he confirmed, his jaw tight. My wife, Eleanor, and Henry were inside. I was 3 towns away on a job. By the time I got home... He stopped, his voice trailing off. The inspector blamed a faulty stove. But you don't think so. The stove was brand new, he said, his voice flat. And there was a man in town, a rancher named Calloway, who'd been fighting Voss over water rights for 2 years. He lived 4 doors down from us. His voice was unnervingly steady, the sound of a man who had replayed a story in his mind until it lost all feeling. Calloway gave up the week after the fire, signed Voss's papers, and moved his whole family to Kansas. Oh, my lord, Clara whispered. I couldn't prove a thing, Eli said. I spent 6 months looking. Voss is too careful for that. Until now, she said. Her hand rested on the canvas bag. Eli, she began, using his first name without thinking. He didn't seem to notice. James wrote everything down. Names, dates, payments for what they did. He documented it all. She held his gaze. Abilene is in here. The muscle in his jaw jumped. You're certain? He asked. I've read it 100 times over, she said. I am absolutely certain. In the corner, a salesman snored, and an old man's spoon scraped his bowl. The rain on the glass had gentled to a whisper. Elias Calhoun laid his palms flat on the table. Henry, he said, the name spoken so softly it was almost a prayer. Henry, Clara repeated, because a name like that deserved to be said aloud. He looked up, and for the first time, the coldness in his gray eyes gave way to something raw and exhausted. I'll get you to Harrow, he promised, whatever it takes. I know, she said. I knew it the moment you offered me your hand on that road. You threw a rock at me first. I threw a rock at you, she agreed. And then I took your hand. I suppose that about sums me up. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, touched the corner of his mouth. Get some sleep, Miss Whitmore. We ride at 4. But she couldn't sleep. She lay in the small room thinking about her husband James and his journals. She thought about a 4-year-old boy named Henry who liked frogs. And she thought about Elias Calhoun, sitting downstairs with a weight on his shoulders too heavy for one man to carry alone. He had not dismissed her questions. He had simply said, not yet. That was the answer of a man who pays his debts, and honesty was a debt. James had been just like that. She swore to herself that she would make sure someone finally read what he wrote. At 3:30, a soft knock came not on her door, but on the wall beside it. She was up in an instant. Eli stood in the hall, his face serious. Harlan Briggs is in town, he said quietly. He's at the stable, alone for now. Clara gripped the door. He found us. He doesn't know we're here yet, Eli said. We have maybe 20 minutes. Grab your bag. Eli, she said, and he answered, Clara. It was the first time they had used each other's names, but neither of them paid it any mind. We'll never make it to Harrow if they keep cutting us off. I know. We need another way. There is a route through Blackthorn Pass, he said. It's east of the main road. It will add half a day to the ride, but Voss's men don't know that country. I know Blackthorn Pass, she said. He gave her a surprised look. My father leased land in the hill country when I was a girl. I know these parts. She stepped back. Give me 2 minutes. You have 1.5, he replied. Then quit talking and let me use them. She thought she heard a quiet, surprised chuckle in the hall as she shut the door. They slipped out the back of the kitchen. Nell held the door, pressing a bundle of cornbread into Clara's hands. Follow the creek bed east, Nell whispered. It'll take you to the base of Blackthorn. Thank you, Clara said. Don't thank me, Nell said, her eyes serious. Just get to Harrow. She then gave Eli a look that said 1,000 words. You had better come back. Nell, Eli started. Just go, she cut him off. They went. The horses were already saddled. The stars were out now, bright and clear. The wet earth smelled of Texas after a good rain, copper, cedar, and green growing things. You were going to answer my question, she said when they were clear of the town. I did answer it, he said. You told me about Henry. That is not the same thing. He was quiet for a long moment. When Voss offered me the $50, he finally said, I took it. It was just a job. Bring in a woman who had something he wanted. What happened after was none of my business. That's what I told myself. His voice was empty of all emotion. Have you ever been so beaten down that all you had left was enough fight to pick up a rock? That is where Eli found Clara. This is a story about how the folks who look the weakest are sometimes the strongest, and how one person choosing not to look away can change a life. Eli saw something in her that day. It was not fear. It was fight. He told her, I found you on your knees and you raised a rock at me, not a gun, a rock. That reminded him of his sister Eleanor. He said if she had only had a chance to fight back, or if just one person had decided not to look the other way, he could not give that chance to Eleanor, but he could give it to Clara. And as they rode into the Texas dawn, that single choice meant everything. Blackthorn Pass looked one way from a distance, but up close it was a different beast altogether. The recent rain had turned the narrow trail into a slick, muddy trap. Eli's horse, Cannon, pushed onward, patient and steady. But Clara's gray mare was getting nervous. A horse can feel danger long before its rider can see it. She is not going to like the middle section, Clara warned. Eli asked if she had been through this way before. She had, twice, but never after a hard July rain. When he asked if they could make it through, her answer was not exactly comforting. Probably, she said. Maybe. He just repeated her words back to her. Probably. Maybe. The only sounds were the horses struggling for footing and the slow tick of a clock in Clara's head. Harlan Briggs was back there somewhere on their trail. Finally, she had to ask, how far behind do you reckon they are? Eli figured if Briggs and his men left at first light, they were about 3 hours behind them. Just as he said it, the gray mare stumbled, catching herself on the slick path. Clara calmed her with a steady hand. Her name is Rosie, she said, needing to break the tense silence. Nell, back at the boarding house. She asked me to bring her back. Eli's voice was grim. Then we had better get through this pass. The middle section was a true nightmare. The path shrunk to a thin ledge, slick with fresh mud. Cannon barely squeezed through with Eli talking to him low and steady. But Rosie planted all 4 feet and refused to move. Clara knew what she had to do. She slid off the saddle and took the reins right by the bit. She put herself between the horse and the long drop, her shoulder brushing against the cold, wet rock wall. She never looked back. She just walked, talking in a low murmur to the frightened animal. Easy now, good girl. Just 1 step. And after a few heart-stopping seconds, Rosie finally followed her. On the other side, Clara leaned her forehead against Rosie's neck, and they both let out a long breath. Eli rode back to where she stood. Do not say a thing, she told him. He almost smiled. My face does that sometimes, he said. I do not always mean it. That sound, that not quite a laugh, caught her by surprise. It reminded her of her husband, James. He always knew how to find a moment for her to breathe, right in the middle of something serious. She had not expected to feel anything like that again. She pushed the thought away and swung back into the saddle. Once they were down from the pass, the world opened up again. The red clay road stretched out before them, a straight shot south to San Antonio and to anyone who might be watching it. The midday Texas heat was heavy and quiet. Clara asked about the next town, Mesquite Springs, about 6 miles away. Eli said they had to avoid it. He knew a rancher, a man named Colton. He was not a friend, but he was not their enemy either. It was their only chance to get water for the horses without being seen. But just as they settled on the plan, they both heard it. Hoofbeats coming fast from the road up ahead. They did not have time to think. In a heartbeat, Eli's rifle was up, and Clara's hand was in her bag. A lone rider came tearing around the bend in the road. He pulled his horse up short, his eyes wide at the sight of their drawn weapons. He was just a kid, maybe 20 years old, and looked like he had been riding for a long, long time. He threw both of his hands in the air. "I am not looking for trouble," he yelled. "Who are you?" Eli demanded, his aim never wavering. The young man swallowed hard. "My name is Roy Tanner. I am a deputy out of Mesquite Springs. Sheriff Dawes sent me to find you." Eli kept the rifle steady. "Why?" Roy slowly reached into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Harlan Briggs and 2 other men. They rode through town about an hour ago. They were asking questions about a woman and a bounty hunter." He held the paper out toward them. "But that is not the main reason. Sheriff Dawes got a wire this morning. It came from San Antonio." The deputy paused for a moment. "It is from Judge Hargrove. He wants to know why Clara Whitmore has not arrived yet." In the heavy silence that followed, Eli and Clara just looked at each other. For the first time, they were not just running from something. They were running to someone. And that changed everything. Eli took the telegraph with a slowness that said he knew the man holding the rifle could be trusted. He read the words, his face a stone mask, but a tension eased out of his shoulders. Or maybe a new kind settled in. He handed the paper to Clara. The message was blunt. It said, "Miss Whitmore, I know about your husband's work and I have been waiting for you. Come straight here. Stop for nothing. Trust no local lawman." It was signed Harrove. She read it again. "Do not trust local law." Her eyes flicked to the young deputy Roy, who looked like he understood the fix they were in. Roy spoke carefully, saying, "Sheriff Dawes told me to tell you he knows what that wire says. He is not offended. He says Judge Harrove is a cautious man for good reason. The sheriff also wants you to know that in 8 years he has never taken a dime from Decker Voss. He figured you would be wondering." "I was," Clara admitted. Roy paused, choosing his next words. "He also said that Briggs and his men are blocking the main road to San Antonio." "There is only one other way to get through," Eli said flatly. "Over Colton's land." A look of relief washed over Roy's face. "Yes, sir. But you know Colton will not let anybody cross his property without asking permission first." "I know," Eli said. "And you have to ask him to his face because he trusts nobody." Eli knew that too. "I will go talk to Colton." The deputy hesitated. "Mr. Calhoun, the last time Colton laid eyes on you, he told the sheriff that if he saw you again, he would run you off his land with a shotgun." "That is more or less how I recall it," Clara said under her breath. Eli shot her a sharp look. "I will talk to Colton," he said again, his voice final. Roy seemed to accept it, nodding as he turned his horse. "I will ride back and watch the south road. If Briggs turns back, I will fire a shot." "1 shot means you turn around," Eli called out. "2 shots means you run. Understood." Roy gave a slight nod, his eyes meeting Clara's one last time. It was a look of pure surprise at what a person could live through. Then he was gone. When the dust settled, Eli finally lowered his rifle. Colton," Clara said. "The man whose nephew you arrested for stealing a horse." "I brought him in," Eli corrected her. Knew it was the right thing to do, even if he did not like it. Eli turned his horse, Cannon, off the road and into the brush. "He is a man who respects what is right." "There is a lot of that going around," Clara said, urging her own horse to follow. After 20 minutes, Colton's ranch house came into view. It was a long, low building of stone and old timber, built by a man who planned on staying put. On the porch, a large white-bearded man sat in a heavy wooden chair with a shotgun resting across his lap. That was Addie Colton. He watched them approach from 100 yards out, perfectly still. His hand was resting on the shotgun like an old familiar tool. Eli stopped his horse 20 feet from the fence. "Addie, it is Calhoun." Colton's voice sounded like rocks in a tin bucket. "You have got a whole lot of nerve." "I do," Eli agreed. "I need to cross your land. I believe the last thing I told you was that I would put a load of buckshot in you if I saw you again." "I remember," Eli said. "And yet here you are, standing on my property." "I am." Colton's gaze shifted to Clara. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the worn dress and the exhaustion etched into her face from 3 weeks of running. "Who is she?" he asked. "Clara Whitmore," Eli answered. Her husband, James Whitmore, was killed by Decker Voss's men 23 days ago. She is carrying proof of everything Voss has done. Land fraud, murder, all of it. She needs to get to Judge Harrove in San Antonio, and Voss's men are blocking the main road. Colton was silent for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the buzz of insects in the heavy air. "Whitmore," he said at last. "James Whitmore, that bookkeeper from over at Redstone Creek." Clara gasped. "You knew him?" Colton's jaw tightened. "He sent me a letter 6 months back. Said he was going to set things right for some of the folks Voss had run off their land." He looked at Clara differently now, like he was checking to see if she matched the story he already knew. He said it was his wife who convinced him. He said she told him. A man who keeps records has a responsibility to what they say. The breath left Clara's body. She had said those exact words to James one morning over tea, never thinking they were important. He had just smiled and jotted something down in a book. "He wrote that down in his letter," Colton said. Then he stood up, looming even larger than before. He carried the shotgun inside, then came down from the porch like a man who owned the world. He stopped at the gate and swung it open. "You can cross my land, Mrs. Whitmore. You and whoever you are riding with." He did not even look at Eli. Eli just rode on through the gate. Clara paused beside the old man. "Thank you," she said. He looked up at her from under his thick white eyebrows. "Do not thank me. 47 families lost their land. You cannot get that back. Just you make sure whatever you are doing counts for something." "I will," she promised. He nodded. Then, as she rode past, he spoke without looking at Eli. "Calhoun." Eli stopped his horse. "My nephew is out of jail," Colton said. "He has been working my west pasture for 2 years now. He is a better man for what he learned." There was a long pause. "I still think you could have found another way to handle it." "I could not," Eli said simply. "I know," Colton admitted. "That does not mean I have to like it." He shut the gate behind them. They rode on in silence for a long time, the afternoon heat pressing down on them. "James wrote to him," Clara finally said, her voice full of wonder. "Sounds like James was building an army," Eli replied. "He never told me a thing." "Maybe he did not want you to worry." "He always told me everything," she said, stating it as a simple, painful fact. Learning something new about a man already gone left a peculiar kind of ache. The information just had nowhere to settle. "We never kept secrets." Eli suggested, maybe he was still thinking on it. Men do that sometimes. They hold something tight until they figure out its shape. She looked straight at him. "Henry, when did you finally tell Eleanor what you were scared of?" He stayed silent. "You held it tight," she said, not pushing, just saying it. "Too long," he admitted. She knew what he meant. She understood how protecting someone you love can slowly build a wall between you. As they reached the top of a low hill, the land stretched out before them. A flash of light caught the sun, and Eli saw it first. He pulled his horse up short, and she stopped beside him. "That's tin," he said. "A roof on a building about half a mile out. Mosquette Springs is 6 miles south of here. That is not Mosquette Springs. It was a single low building. No road led to it, no other structures anywhere near. It had to be a line cabin or an old relay station, a place for men who needed to stay off the map. Eli's hand froze on the reins. 3 horses tied up outside, he said, his voice low. She squinted and counted. He was right. 3 horses tied to a rail. Briggs rode through Mosquet Springs an hour ago, she said slowly. Roy saw him on the main road. Eli repeated her words flatly. Roy saw Briggs and 2 other men. The math clicked into place in her mind. 3 horses, she said, 3 men. Then a new thought hit her. Dutch, she whispered. He is not with Briggs. No, Eli confirmed, he is not. She looked at him. He was staring at the cabin, his face like a man adding up numbers that only led to a bad answer. He rode on ahead, she realized. He knew about Blackthorn Pass. He knew about Colton's land, and that we would have to cut east. Someone told him. Eli agreed. Someone in Dusty Creek. Or someone between there and here. He glanced back at the empty trail behind them. Someone who knows this country better than Briggs. Clara's mind raced. Not Nell or Roy, they had warned them. Not Colton. It had to be someone else. Someone she never even considered. How long do you reckon he's been there, she asked. Long enough to get settled in, Eli said. Long enough to be waiting. The cabin sat squarely between them and the road to San Antonio. Going around it would cost them 2 hours, putting them in a bad spot by nightfall. He is not waiting to take me back, she said plainly. Eli looked at her. Briggs needs me alive. Voss has to know what I have, who I talk to, and where that ledger is. Dutch does not have those orders. She met his eyes, her meaning clear. He is waiting to make sure the ledger never reaches Hargrove. It does not matter what happens to me. She said it because it was the simple truth. Eli stared at her for a long moment. She saw something shift in his expression. It was not fear for himself. It was the same look he had when she first said the name Abilene. I am not going back, she said. I know, he answered. And I am not stopping. I know that too. He turned back toward the cabin, his hand moving to his rifle. Here is what we are going to do. She waited. I am going to ride straight for it, he said. That is a terrible idea, she shot back. That is not a plan. It is a distraction. He looked her square in the eye. You ride south and you ride hard. When Dutch hears a rider coming from the north, he will have to come outside. That will give you 60 seconds, maybe 90. And you? She asked. I have been in worse spots than this. She just stared at him. Eli, Clara. He said her name with a certainty that left no room for argument. Judge Hargrove is 4 hours south. That ledger has 47 families in it. It has Henry's name in it. His jaw was tight. You are not going to sit here and argue with me. I am not arguing, she said, her voice sharp. I am telling you that you are not nothing. Do you understand me? Whatever you have told yourself since Abilene, you are not a distraction. You are not expendable. He just looked at her, the heat and the buzzing insects fading into the background. James thought he was being kind, she said softly, by not telling me things. He was wrong. So do not do that to me. Do not decide what I can handle. Something changed in his face, a look that was close to softness. 70 seconds, he said. That is all I am asking for. You had better still be breathing when I get back with Hargrove's men. I intend to be. Intend harder, she told him. He almost smiled. Then he turned his horse north, and she turned Rosie south and kicked her into a run. Behind her, she heard Eli let out a loud shout, the sound of a man making his presence known. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on the Texas road stretching out ahead of her. 4 hours to San Antonio, 47 families in the ledger, and one name that mattered more than all the rest. Henry. She heard the single clean shot when she was a quarter of a mile away. One shot meant turn around. Clara's hands tightened on the reins, but she urged Rosie to keep running. She did not turn around. She told herself the ledger mattered more, that the families mattered more. She told herself that every second she lost was a second Briggs gained from behind. She kept riding, but the sound of that single shot sat like a stone in her chest. They had agreed. One shot means turn back. Rosie found her stride, a steady rhythm on the flat ground. Clara let her run, scanning the empty southern road and listening. She heard nothing. The silence was far worse than the gunshot had been. She had gone another half a mile when she heard a second horse coming up fast behind her. It was staying on the road, not trying to flank her. If it was Briggs, he would come at her from the side. This was a straight pursuit. She glanced back and saw Roy Tanner riding hard, his bent badge glinting in the sun. She did not slow down. He pulled up right beside her. "He is alive!" Roy yelled over the pounding hooves. The breath rushed out of Clara's chest. "He is pinned down!" Roy shouted. Dutch came out like he figured. But he was not alone. There were two of them. Eli got Dutch, but the other one shot him on his way out. "How bad is he?" "Still moving when I left. He told me to find you." Roy looked at her. "He said to tell you to keep riding and not do anything foolish." Word for word. Clara considered that for about 2 seconds. "What does he think is foolish?" "He did not say," Roy admitted. "I think he figures most things you do are close to foolish." "That is fair," she said. "He also said—" Roy paused. "Just say it." "He said if you turn around before you get to Hargrove, he will be extremely irritated." She almost laughed. Even now, that man found the perfect words. "What about Briggs?" she asked. "On the South Road. He is moving steady, not running. He is riding like a man who knows where you are going and figures he will get there about the same time." Roy's voice grew tense. "He is not trying to catch you out here, Mrs. Whitmore. He is trying to be there when you arrive." The truth of it landed on her like a physical weight. Hargrove's office in San Antonio. Voss had men there too. A man like him did not stop at the city limits. "Do not trust local law," the telegram had warned. But James had been certain that Hargrove himself was clean. James, who checked everything, had trusted him. She had to trust him too. "How far ahead of us is Briggs?" she asked. "He had a head start," Roy said, his jaw tight. "Maybe 40 minutes. "There is a faster way," she said suddenly. Roy looked over at her, surprised. "East of the main road, about 3 miles south, there is a creek crossing. If we cut through there, we can shave a whole hour off the trip to San Antonio. We would come into the city from the south, through the stockyards." "Briggs will be waiting for us on the main road," Roy said, catching on quick. "Briggs thinks I do not know this country," she said, turning her horse, Rosie, into the brush. "He is wrong about that." They rode hard, and Roy proved his worth. He did not ask questions or doubt her. He just kept his horse right alongside hers, his eyes scanning the land. He was young, but he was learning fast. As they rode, she decided she could trust him completely. "Your Sheriff Dawes," she asked. "How well do you know him?" "I have worked for him for 2 years." "Has he ever taken money from Voss?" Roy answered without a second of hesitation. "No." "Are you sure?" "My father had a ranch in Caldwell County for 20 years, Roy said, his voice changing, becoming personal. "Voss's men came for his land 3 years ago. Sheriff Dawes was the only lawman in 4 counties who bothered to file a report on it. It did not stop them, but he put it on the record." Roy looked straight at her. "I know what is in that bag you are carrying. I know what your husband did. I would like to think my father's name is in there." "Tanner," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Page 41, she replied. "Gideon Tanner, 40 acres in Caldwell County. February 1879. Roy said nothing, his face a mixture of shock and gratitude as they rode on. He stared straight ahead and just rode. Clara knew better than to say anything. Some things just need to be witnessed, not fixed. They rode in silence for a while before he spoke again. The creek crossing. How deep you figure. On a dry day, knee-high to a horse. Tonight, she guessed, chest-high and moving fast. You think Rosie can make it? She made it through Blackthorn Pass, didn't she? Fair point. They found the crossing, and it was worse than she thought. The July rains had turned a simple creek into a muddy, raging torrent. That's chest-high if we're lucky, he said. Then we swim, Clara said, and spurred Rosie into the water before she could second-guess it. The cold shocked her. Rosie fought the current, and for a terrifying few seconds Clara was holding the bag high above her head, putting all her faith in the horse beneath her. Rosie, the horse, knew what to do. She came bucking out of that flooded creek, shaking water everywhere and looking mighty put out. Clara was soaked clean through, her boots ruined, but the satchel on her back was bone dry. Young Roy followed, looking like he was rethinking his whole life. He asked, "You always ride that hard?" Clara just said, "Only lately," and pointed them south toward San Antonio. When they finally rode in, the city noise hit Clara hard. It was a place full of people who had no idea she'd spent 3 days in the mud and mountains just to get to them. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. She told Roy, "Harrove's office, north side of the plaza, brown building." Roy scanned the street. "I don't see Briggs." Clara knew what that meant. "He's already here." Roy's hand went to his gun, but she stopped him. "Not yet, not out in the open." They rode on, steady and calm, like folks with legitimate business. Clara clutched the raw-hide strap of the bag. She hadn't come all this way just to get sloppy now. 2 blocks from the plaza, a man stepped out from an alley. He wasn't Briggs. He was a thick-set fellow with his hat pulled low. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice quiet but sure. Before he could say more, Roy had his gun drawn. The man didn't flinch. "I work for Judge Harrove. My name is Miles Cord. He sent me to tell you Harlan Briggs got here 40 minutes ago." Cord explained that Briggs went straight to the duty marshal, a man named Pitts. "Pitts has been taking money from Voss since 1879, he said grimly. "The judge has been building a case against him, too." He eyed her satchel. "He needs what you're carrying to shut both of them down for good." Roy wasn't convinced. "Prove you work for the judge." Cord slowly pulled a folded paper from his coat. It was a short note from Harrove, confirming Cord was his trusted clerk and giving them new instructions. "He sent this morning," Cord said. "He figured Briggs, or someone like him, was coming." Clara asked, "Where is Briggs now?" "With Pitts," Cord answered. "They're trying to get a writ to seize your bag before you can reach the judge." "You've got maybe 30 minutes before it's official," Cord warned. "Then we move now," Clara declared. But there was another problem. "Briggs left a man watching the east entrance on Commerce Street," Cord said. Roy muttered something under his breath. Clara thought fast. She had the ledger, a crooked marshal inside, and Briggs with a head start. "How many ways are there into that federal building?" she asked. 3 public doors, Cord replied. "And a loading dock on the west side, but it's bolted from the inside." "Is there anyone in there who can unbolt it?" she pressed. Cord paused for a second. "The judge has been in his office since 7 this morning." Clara turned to Roy. "Can you keep that man on Commerce Street busy for 10 minutes without shooting him?" She considered that a moment. What kind of trouble? The kind without a body. That she could handle. Then get to it. She looked at Cord. "Take me to the loading dock." Cord started to speak. "Now," she said. He moved. She followed him down alleys and side streets, her bag bumping against her hip. San Antonio went on about its business, paying no mind to a man and a woman, walking like they had somewhere to be. It struck Clara as strange how the biggest moments of your life could look so ordinary to everyone else. The loading dock was just as Cord said, with a solid door bolted from the inside. He knocked a pattern. 3 quick, 2 slow. As Clara counted to 32, she heard the bolt slide back. Judge Hargrove stood there. In her mind, he'd been a towering, sharp-edged man, hardened by years in a crooked system. The real man was smaller, older, and tired in a way that was more comforting than intimidating. He was about 65, a slender man with gray hair and watchful eyes that had seen too much. He glanced at her, then at the bag. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Judge Hargrove," she replied. "We have less than 30 minutes. Come in," he said. They walked through a plain back hall that smelled like old paper and wax. Hargrove moved quickly for his age, leading her up a set of stairs and into an office so crammed with books and files, the walls seemed like an afterthought. He sat behind his desk and she took the chair across from him. Cord stood by the door. She placed the leather satchel on the desk. With hands that were almost steady, she untied the cord. "My husband was James Whitmore," she said. "I know," the judge said. "He wrote to me." Clara looked up, surprised. 4 months ago. Hargrove pulled a letter from his desk. It was James's careful handwriting, something she'd know anywhere. Seeing it in this man's hand felt like a punch to the gut. "He told me what he was putting together. He said he had proof." Judge Hargrove paused, a look of grief crossing his face. "He told me he wasn't sure how much time he had. He wanted me to know that if anything happened, his wife would know where to find the records and that she would come." Clara sat perfectly still. "He was that sure of you," Hargrove said. "He should have told me," she said, her voice rough. "He said you would say that," Hargrove answered softly. She shut her eyes for just a second, picturing James, the man who kept careful records and paid his debts, and who had, it turned out, left her a map she never knew she was following. She opened her eyes and pushed the satchel toward the judge. "Then, let's finish what he started." Hargrove pulled the bag to his side of the desk and began to read. The room was silent but for the sound of turning pages. She heard the door open and turned to see Harlan Briggs. He hadn't come through the loading dock. He'd walked right through the main office door, the one Cord had closed but not locked. Cord was no longer at the door. He was pinned against the wall, a gun pressed to his back. Briggs was not what she'd imagined. She had pictured someone big and crude. Instead, he was an average man, with ordinary features. The only thing that stood out were his eyes. They were tired, but not like Judge Hargrove's. Hargrove was tired from working hard. Briggs was tired from carrying a heavy burden for so long he'd forgotten how to set it down. He looked at Clara, then at the satchel, and the pages spread across the desk. "I will need those," he said. "You need to leave my office," Hargrove said. He didn't even look up from the papers. "Judge, I am reviewing evidence in a federal matter." Hargrove's voice was calm, the voice of a man who'd spent 40 years being in control. "You are in a federal building without permission. Whatever Marshal Pitts promised you, it does not apply in here." He turned another page. "And this building has 2 more exits you have not covered." "I covered them an hour ago," Briggs snapped. "You covered the ones you knew about," Hargrove said. Briggs's jaw tightened. Clara had been watching him, studying his eyes. In her weeks on the run, she had learned to tell a real man from a bluff. "You knew James," she stated. Briggs froze. "I am not guessing," she said. "I found a letter in his desk. It was not with the ledger, but with his personal things. He wrote it to an old friend he was sorry to be fighting against." Briggs said nothing. "He never sent it," Clara continued. "Maybe he was trying to decide if you were a man who could still be reasoned with." She looked at the deep weariness in Briggs's eyes. "Could you have been?" The man holding Cord shifted. Briggs raised a hand and the man stilled. "I have a job to do," Briggs said. "You have a choice," Clara answered. "James believed that. He wrote it in the letter to you. James is dead." "Yes," she said, the word clean and hard. "He is dead because he also made a choice." She stared right at Briggs. "What do you want to be, Harlan, when all this is over? Because Voss will be finished, whether it is today with this ledger or a year from now with the next one." James was not the only one who kept records. She laid her hand flat on the desk. "What do you want to have left?" The building was silent, and then 2 gunshots echoed from downstairs. 2 shots meant run. Eli. Everything happened at once. Briggs spun toward the noise. The gunman hesitated for a split second, and in that second, cord moved. The gun bucked and sent a shot straight into the ceiling. White plastered dust rained down on all of them. Hargrove didn't so much as flinch, just kept his hands pressed flat on that ledger like it was the only thing in the world. But Clara was already moving. 2 shots didn't mean run away, they meant Eli was still in the fight, and if he was fighting, he was alive. She flew down the stairs, the shouts from the room fading behind her. The echo of the gunfire pulled her through a side door and into a lower hall where she nearly ran smack into Roy Tanner. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead and holding his pistol with both hands. Roy got right to it. "He is outside by the loading dock. He walked all the way from the relay cabin. That is a good 4 miles, and with a bullet in him. How bad is he?" Roy's grim face was all the answer she needed. She pushed past him. Elias Calhoun was there, all right, leaning against the big loading dock door frame. One hand held him steady, the other was pressed to his side where his shirt was soaked dark with blood. But he was on his feet, and his eyes were clear. The first thing he asked her was about the ledger. "Hargrove has it safe," she told him. Just a little of the tension left his shoulders. "Briggs is upstairs," she said, putting a hand on his arm to steady him. "I saw him go in," Eli growled. "I could not get to him in time." "It is handled," she said. "Cord and Hargrove took care of things, and I spoke with Briggs myself." "You talked to him?" Eli asked, his voice strained. His man had the gun, not him. She slid her shoulder under his arm. "We can talk about my methods later. Right now, just let me help you. I was about to say it is not as bad as it looks." "That is the same thing," she said. He leaned his weight on her without a fight, which told her everything about how bad it really was. Roy moved to his other side, and they helped Eli back against the wall. Then Eli said the name, Pitts, the crooked marshal. "He will have heard the shots." "Hargrove knows about Pitts," Clara said. "He told me he is building a case. A case is not going to do us much good in the next 5 minutes," Eli said, each word costing him. "Pitts has federal authority in this building." "Well, then Hargrove needs to get down here first," Roy said. "I will go get him." "Go?" Clara told him. Roy took off up the stairs. She stayed with Eli, the warmth of his blood seeping into her sleeve. 4 miles, she said, shaking her head. "He said it is a graze." "It is not a graze." "It grazed several things," he admitted. His face was pale, running on nothing but pure grit. She had worn that same look herself for 23 days. "You could have stayed at the cabin," she said softly. "No, I could not." "Clara." He said her name plain and simple, like a fact that was already settled. "I was not going to wait to find out how this ended. You were shot." "I have been shot before." She almost smiled in spite of it all. She rested her forehead against his shoulder for just a second, just to feel that he was real and standing there. "Henry's name is in front of a federal judge now," she told him quietly. Eli was still for a moment. "Yeah. James put it there. You got me here." "Both of them," he said. They stood with that for a moment. Then the stairwell above them filled with the sound of heavy boots and loud voices. It was the sound of authority on the move. Clara instinctively stepped partly in front of Eli, shielding him. Roy came down first, followed by Hargrove and 2 deputies who looked like they meant business. And right behind them, walking with his hands in plain sight, was Harron Briggs. He was not in cuffs. Clara went rigid. "Wait," Roy said, catching her eye. Hargrove came to the bottom of the stairs, looked Eli over, and then turned to Clara. "It is done," he said. "Pitts is in custody. My deputies were in the building waiting for my signal." He held up the leather satchel. "The ledger is safe. I have read enough to start proceedings. A full indictment against Decker Voss will be ready before the end of the week." Clara had to hear the words twice before they finally sank in. "It is done," she repeated in a whisper. "There is still significant work ahead," Hargrove said. "A man who knew better than to celebrate too early. But yes, the foundation your husband built will hold." She looked at the satchel. She thought of the 47 families, of James's careful handwriting, and the long road it took to get it here. "Mr. Calhoun needs a doctor," she said, finding her voice. "There is one 2 blocks east," Hargrove said, and nodded to a deputy. "Take them." As Roy and the deputy helped Eli, Hargrove called out, "Mrs. Whitmore!" He was holding the satchel out to her. "I have everything I need for the case," he said. "The originals belong to you, to James." She took it, holding it to her chest. She stood there in the back hall of the federal building, with mud on her boots and plaster in her hair, and blood on her sleeve that was not her own. For the first time in 23 days, she had nowhere she had to be. The stillness of it nearly put her on her knees. She took a deep breath, turned, and followed Eli and Roy out into the afternoon sun. As she passed the stairs, she stopped and looked at Briggs. He was still there. He had not run when he had the chance. "The letter," Clara said. "You should know. He wrote it. He just never sent it. I do not know why." Briggs was quiet for a second. He probably could not figure out what he wanted me to do. "I told the judge everything," Briggs said, his voice as flat as a West Texas prairie. "Names, dates, the whole business. Voss will say I'm lying to save my own skin, and I reckon he's partly right. I am not a good man, Mrs. Whitmore, but there is a line I did not cross." Clara waited. "James Whitmore," he said, his jaw tight as a drum. "That was not my order. I want that put on the record." Clara could not forgive him, not then. But she believed that one thing, and she knew it cost him something to say it. "I will tell Judge Hargrove," she promised, then walked back out into the sun and the noise of the city. Down the block, Roy was holding a doctor's door open. Eli stood in that doorway, held up by pure grit and not much else. He gave her that direct, gray-eyed look which was his way of asking a question. "It is done," she said. He gave a single nod. "I was not stalling," he told her as Roy helped him inside. "I was waiting to see if you were all right." The doctor went to work right away, a man who had seen it all before. Eli's answers to his questions were short, not from stubbornness, but from plain exhaustion. His body was finally calling in its debts. Clara found a chair by the wall, setting the heavy satchel on her lap. With one hand resting on that satchel, she breathed steady and let her mind settle. She thought of James, writing in his ledger night after night. She thought of a 4-year-old boy named Henry, and of 47 families who had been wronged. A few blocks away, a judge was reading the book that would change everything. She remembered being on her knees in the red Texas mud, and the man on the horse who had offered a hand. The future was still a hazy thing. There was the long, plain work of seeing justice through, and Roy's father's land in Caldwell County. And then there was Eli. She could not rightly see the shape of that part just yet. When she heard him say her name, she went into the other room. Eli was sitting on the examination table, a clean bandage wrapped around his ribs. "Hargrove really has it?" he asked. "He has it," she confirmed. "The ledger, and Briggs too. He is giving testimony." Eli took that in, slow and careful, like he did everything. He told her Briggs claimed he did not know about Abilene, that he wanted it on the record. "You believe him?" Eli asked. "About that specific thing, yes." She watched him adjust to this new piece of the truth, its weight shifting after a long, hard year. "Henry," Eli said softly, the name sounding like a debt being paid. "Henry," Clara repeated. The doctor finished his work. "You will live," he told Eli. "Now, you are done moving for today." "Agreed," they both said. After the doctor left, the room grew quiet. As the Texas heat of the afternoon began to break, Eli started to say her name. "Clara." "Do not," she said, stopping him. "Not yet." And she meant it as a promise, not a no. "There is a lot of road between here and whatever comes next," she said. "I know that," he answered, "but we are both still here." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "Yeah," he said, "we are." She sat beside him, her hand resting on the satchel like a thing she intended to keep. 3 weeks after that day, Decker Voss was arrested at his ranch. 4 federal deputies and a United States Marshal from Austin took him in. He had been waiting for them like a man waiting on a train he knew was on time. Roy rode all the way to San Antonio to tell her in person. They sat over coffee in her new boarding house. He did not fight it, Roy said. He walked right out in a pressed suit like he was headed to a business meeting. He knew it was coming, Clara replied. His lawyers filed 3 motions that very afternoon. Judge Hargrove denied all 3 before the sun went down. She told Roy that the judge had already sent her a note. The ledger was in the record and she would be there to testify. "How many of the 47 families know?" she asked. "The judge's office has reached 31 so far. Some of the others," Roy explained, "could not be found, or had not survived what was done to them." His voice went quiet. "The ones they reached," he said. "Not a single one was surprised. They all knew what happened. They just did not know someone had written it all down." Clara pictured James at his kitchen table, writing names because a truth that is not recorded is a truth that is lost. "My father's land," Roy said at last. "Hargrove says there will be compensation. The land itself is long gone." He stared into his coffee. "My father died 2 years ago. He always said somebody should have to answer for it." "Somebody will," Clara told him, looking him straight in the eye. James made sure of it. "Your father's name is in that record, Roy. Federal now. It does not just go away." Roy simply nodded. He understood. He left the next morning after a handshake and a promise to visit if he ever came through San Antonio again. Clara watched him ride away from the boarding house door. She thought about how the folks you need most sometimes show up on the road ahead, and sometimes they ride up from behind you with a bent badge and a horse already in motion. She went inside and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Judge Hargrove, confirming she would testify. The second was to the school board in the town she had been headed for, explaining her delay and asking if the teacher position was still available. Their reply arrived 4 days later. The job had been filled. She sat with the letter, then wrote back asking if they needed help in any other way. It was an instinct James would have understood, the refusal to quit just because things did not work out the first time. She was waiting for an answer when Eli knocked. It was his way, direct and without fuss. 2 solid knocks that just said, "I am here." She had learned to read him in small ways these past few weeks. He was staying in a hotel a few streets away. He had tried to leave town twice, but had come back both times. Once for a deposition, and once for a reason he never gave and she never asked for. She opened the door. He looked better. Not healed, not completely. His shoulder was still stiff, and a tension remained in his eyes that the doctor said would fade in a few months. But he looked more present, more himself than he had in the doctor's office when the fight had finally drained out of him. He held his hat in his hands. "I have something to tell you," he said. She stepped aside to let him in. He stood in the middle of her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. Eli said, "I went to see Briggs." He was turning his hat over and over in his hands. "He's in the federal holding cell while Hargrove gets the testimony ready." Eli told her he'd waited 3 long hours just to get 10 minutes with the man. "I had to know for certain, Clara, from his own mouth." Eli's jaw was tight. "He told me he didn't know about the fire. He had nothing to gain by lying, no deal on the table. He just said it." Then Eli added something else. He said Voss ordered the Abilene job himself. He used a man Briggs didn't even know. Briggs only found out 6 months later and had been wrestling with what to do about it for 8 months since. "What did you say to him?" Clara asked. "Nothing," Eli said. "There was nothing to say." "Do you believe him?" she asked. "Yes," he said, his voice full of a strange certainty. "I believe him too," she said quietly. He stood there, completely still, the way he did when he was working something out deep inside. "Does it change anything?" she asked. "No," he said, his voice firm. "It doesn't change what happened to Eleanor, or to Henry." Saying his son's name still cost him something, but less than it did a few weeks ago. "But it changes what I do now. Where I put all this, Where do you put it? She asked softly. He looked at her for a long time. I'm still working on that. She simply nodded. It was an honest answer. She knew the kind of grief he carried didn't just disappear in a few weeks, or maybe ever. She'd learned to carry her own grief differently. Like a heavy weight you learn to manage over time. I'm done bounty hunting, he said suddenly. I'm not taking another job. He looked her straight in the eye. I've been thinking about what that fella Colton said, about a man learning something when he's held accountable. He added, I know this country. I know who's honest and who ain't. Judge Harov needs investigators he can trust to bring back the truth. So you'd work for the judge? Clara said. I'd work for the law, he corrected. The real law, not just whoever posts the highest reward. He paused. It would keep me here in this part of Texas. The room was quiet for a moment. The school board wrote back, Clara said, her voice even. The teaching position was already filled. That could be weeks, Eli said, talking about the testimony. And all those families are going to need help, she continued. They'll need someone to help with papers, with statements, someone to just sit with them. She looked down at her hands. My James was a bookkeeper. I'm a teacher. Both jobs are about making sure things are understood and remembered. She looked up, her eyes clear. I think that's what I'm supposed to do now. Eli watched her for a long moment. You know what makes you different from anyone else I've ever met? He asked. She shook her head. You just don't stop, he said. Not when you're beat down in the mud and not when the school board turns you away. He paused, his voice softer. And not when you've lost the person who was supposed to be right here with you. The words settled in her heart. James would have liked you, she said. He would have found you aggravating for about 2 days. Then he would have decided you were the most trustworthy man he'd ever met. Good judge of folks. He had Hargrove pegged. He had Colton pegged. He saw a lot of things clear as day. And he saw you, Eli said. She let out a breath. He wrote to Hargrove that his wife was on her way. Eli said he already knew. He knew which way you would turn, so he went on and paved the road for you. He took a single step her way, not crowding her, just closing a little of the space. That ain't nothing, Clara. That was a man who knew the woman he married. She got to her feet. Sitting down just felt wrong. After 3 long weeks of this careful quiet between them, it was like holding your breath underwater. It just had to end, not because it was all fixed, but because it was real. She crossed the space between them. She laid her hand on his chest, gentle with his shoulder, and felt his heart beating steady under her palm. It was the same heartbeat she had trusted on a dark road 3 weeks ago. I am not replacing James, she said. I know, he said in a heartbeat. I am not replacing Eleanor. I am not. He laid his hand over hers. It was a hot July in San Antonio back in 1882. Clara and Eli stood in that little room, a whole lot of history hanging in the air between them. They both knew the path ahead was going to be anything but easy. Just then, a knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Aldridge, sounding polite but businesslike. A letter had arrived for Mrs. Whitmore, marked urgent from the office of Judge Hargrove. Clara opened it. The note was short, right to the point. The man who had upended her life, a fellow named Voss, had entered a plea. His lawyer wanted a personal meeting with Clara. He claimed his client wanted to make a statement face-to-face with James Whitmore's widow before the whole thing started. Her attendance, it said, was her choice. Clara read the letter and passed it to Eli. His face shifted through a series of expressions before settling on a look of careful concern. He told her, You do not have to go. I know what that man is trying to do. She nodded. He is trying to get a feel for me. He wants to see who he is up against. He wants to know if I can be rattled. She took the letter back from Eli and folded it neatly. That man has run this part of the country for 20 years because he knows just how much pressure to apply to people. He wants to see what I am made of. She placed the letter on the table. He already had his chance to do that. His men came to my house on a Tuesday morning. They took the most important person in my world, and they left me standing there to warn me what would happen if I kept going. Her voice was steady as a rock, but I did not stop. I walked 300 yards through the mud to deliver my James's ledger to a federal judge. And I will sit in that courtroom and say every last word that needs to be said. She picked up her jacket. But I will not be going to that meeting. Clara wrote the reply herself, just 4 simple words in her own handwriting. The record speaks for itself. She sealed the note and gave it to Mrs. Aldridge to send back to the judge's office. When she returned to the room, Eli was still standing right where she had left him. He held his hat in his hand, looking like a man who just saw something powerful and was figuring out how to think about it. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "It is just your face. My face does things, you know." "What is it doing now?" he asked. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. Then he smiled a real, honest-to-goodness smile. "It is doing just fine," he said. Clara Whitmore had started this whole ordeal on her knees in the mud with absolutely nothing left, but she was standing now. She planned to keep on standing for James, for all those families who lost their land, and for herself. She would also stand for the man in her room with the healed shoulder and the real smile, who had traveled that long, hard road with her. She had not come all this way just to quit. She was never the kind of woman who knew how to stop, and finally she had someone standing beside her who understood that completely.